Nice little intro. Hi, everyone. I'm Gabriela Ospina, currently lead designer at Calepa, an AI-powered insurance underwriting tool. All throughout my career, I've had to deal with complexity, whether in investment banking, human capital management, commerce platforms, or insurances. I've always found my way to complex domains. As a designer, I used to refer to myself as a problem solver. But later, I realized that one of my core skills is actually managing complexity. I'm a complexity manager. I'm still a problem solver. But for me, to be able to solve those problems, I first need to understand the complexity that I'm working with. And how do I do that, you might ask? I do it by focusing on the pieces that make up a domain and by asking smart questions that will lead me to the most intuitive and valuable solution for our users. Before I go any farther, there's one thing I want to make sure we have clear. Complexity doesn't always mean complicated. When something is complex, it means it has a lot of components. When something is complicated, it means it has a higher level of difficulty, usually not matching the user's mental model. So let's not use the excuse of complexity to build complicated products. Let's approach complexity with an open and curious mind. Let's ask those smart questions so we can understand it and simplify it for our users. When we look at traditional design methods, like the double diamond, for example, designers have been taught to use these type of methods to help us organize our thoughts. But our thoughts are far from being organized after we have done our research, defined the problem, and we need to move into a solution space. We still have a lot of open questions that we need to get answers to. And many times, with the pressure of stakeholders wanting to see something, designers are resourcing to their own tools, trying to get answers to these questions. Many times, it looks like this. Designers are jumping straight into designing screens and interfaces, and at the same time, they're designing the content, information architecture, and trying to validate the business rules. What they're doing here is multitasking. And we know that multitasking is just doing a bunch of things badly at the same time. What we should be doing before designing any screen is defining the structure, the system, and validating the business rules. And I'm not saying this should be a designer's solo job or a PM's responsibility or an engineer's job. It should be a collaborative effort among all members of the product creation team. Now, I want you to reflect a little bit into your own process. Do you know how you and your team are trying to understand the domain and complexity you might be working with? Do you think you're trying to understand your domain by focusing on the nouns or the verbs? I think I see a couple blank stares, although the light doesn't let me see much. But let me put it this way. Are you trying to understand your domain by defining the objects on your system or by creating task flows, user stories? Most of the time, teams try to understand the complexity and the domain that they're working with by being task-oriented, by creating task flows and user stories. There are a couple things that are not ideal with this approach. When we focus on the verb, we often prioritize for the happy path, and deprioritize the instances where the users goes off path. With this, we can easily overlook the opportunities that we have to make natural connections. This also happens when we need to add any feature into the product, designers are left trying to find creative ways to make it fit into a screen, often creating disjointed user experiences. There is another thing that is not ideal with this approach. When we focus on the verbs and when we create user stories, we can easily forget about all the other actions that the objects in the feature offer the users, as we limit ourselves with the constraints that user stories often create. When we try to approach complexity by focusing on the nouns, by being object-oriented, what we do here is we first try to understand all the things the problem is made out of. Then we try to figure out and ideate all the things that possible solutions could be made out of, and find the relationship between them to then create our user stories. This way, we can keep our interactions as intuitive and straightforward as possible. We first need to understand what is it that we're working with before we decide what to do with it. The concept of object-oriented is not new. It has been around since the 1950s. In the early 1990s, Dave Collins wrote a book called Designing Object-Oriented User Interfaces. A couple years after, Everett Yankee wrote an article called Object Focus versus Task Focus Design. And most recently, Sophia Prater, one of my mentors, coined the term object-oriented UX. Object-oriented UX is a philosophy of design that respects the fact that humans think in objects. Therefore, the digital representation of those objects must be clear, connected, and easily recognizable. Along with that, Sophia also created the ORCA process. ORCA is an object-oriented UX framework that helps you translate research and requirement into a clarified design structure. ORCA requires blue, yellow, red, and green stickies. You'll know why later. And it also refers to the 4 main questions we should be asking before designing any screen. What are the objects that make up the user's mental model? What are the relationships between those objects? What are the call to actions that the objects offer the users? And what are the attributes that make up those objects? ORCA is not a new UX process. It's just a new tool of your already existing process. So let's bridge the gap between research and design with the help of ORCA. Let's dive into ORCA and the first questions. What are the objects that make up the user's mental model? We focus on objects because they are the valuable things that the users and the business cares about. Not to be confused by components, users are not going into an app for a drop-down or a calendar picker. They're going into an app for a specific person, place, or thing. Nouns. To give you a better idea of what objects and nouns are in relation to an actual product, I'm going to use Instagram as an example. We can find profile, post, message, comment, poll, quiz, template, question, and stickers as some of the objects in the app. Another example used in LinkedIn, we have some similar objects as Instagram. We have person, company, group, a post, a message, a comment, experience, recommendations, job post. All of these are nouns, therefore objects in the system. One more example, at Bolt, the delivery app, we can also see consumer, courier, support, restaurant, store, venue, menu, menu item, and order. In this example, we can clearly see that they are in the people, place, and thing category. As I also know that visuals speak more than words, and your stakeholders are still going to want to see something, and they're probably not going to understand the tiles, you can translate those objects into wireframe format if you desire. You can also, if you want to understand the objects that make up your product or application, reverse engineer your designs and figure out what those objects are. This is what I've done here. This is also something that engineers actually do when we deliver final designs. They need to figure out what does the design contain? What are those objects they need to begin with? If you can provide your engineers with these type of designs earlier in the process, you'll be setting them up for success. Here's another example of the same restaurant object, just different layout in a different section of the app. A lot of those questions that I mentioned we probably had at the beginning without structure are going to naturally start to come up. And it might look like this. Are X and Y the same thing? On Instagram, is a post and a reel the same thing? If not, how are they different? At Bolt, is the venue the same thing as the store? Or is the store the same thing as the restaurant? If not, how are they different? What are some examples of this thing? You want to start creating a mental image of what this object represents. You want to know if you can define the thing, if the thing that you're thinking about is the thing. We want to make sure we're clear on what is it that we need. We want to make sure we can answer all of these questions. If you or no one from your team is able to answer all of these questions, it is a good sign that you might want to go back into research and get clarity on these questions. Because the last thing that we want is get all the way to development, having designed something that we don't need. So let's avoid designing a square peg to later find out we need to fit it into the round hole. The second question of the ORCA process talks about relationships. What are the relationships between the objects? Defining the relationship of objects help us clarify how different entities within a system are connected and how users might interact with them. Connections are everywhere. We don't need to invent them. We just need to see them. Defining the relationship of objects helps users understand better the objects they're interacting with in the context of the product and how they relate to each other. Having a clear understanding of this relationship also helps designers create better navigation structures by using nested content. Also, understanding the relationship helps all product creators inform the backend structure, helping prevent inconsistencies and reduce complexity. If I have any engineers in the room or anyone with an engineering background, you have already probably made the connection with object-oriented programming. Similar to that, similar to engineers having to visualize these relationships, ORCA practitioners also do it. Engineers do it through UML diagrams. I personally find this very complicated to understand. The way that ORCA practitioners do it is through a nested object matrix. The way that it works is that we bring our objects across the x-axis, and we start forming columns with their related objects and their cardinality. So the way to read this will be an account could have 0 to many posts. We're talking about Instagram here. An account could have 0 to many messages, 0 to many account followings, or 0 to many account followers. On the post, a post must have an owner. It cannot live without an owner. It could have 0 to many messages, and it could have 0 to many comments. A few more examples on LinkedIn. We see also we have the post relationship here with the person. We have a person could have 0 to many posts, 0 to many experiences, 0 to many groups, and 0 to many recommendations. On the Volt app, given the venue as an example, a venue must have a menu, and this is in relationship to the consumer app. These objects go throughout the different applications that Volt has, but the mechanics and the purpose of each of them is different. A venue can actually exist for a merchant without the need of a menu, but in the context of the consumer, they will never see a venue without a menu. You can continue translating this into wireframe formats if you desire, but the most beneficial thing to do is to start testing earlier those navigations. So from here, we went from the object, the restaurant object, into the venue, where we could see the menu. In the menu, we got the menu items. And from the menu items, we were able to go into the order. More questions are going to continue to come up, and they might look like this. What is the relationship between this object and the other object? Can this thing have many Ys, or is it just going to be one? Is this thing ever going to have 0? Aside from validating the business rule, we're also trying to get an idea of what type of screens we need. If in this phase we have decided that something will never have an empty state, there's no need to design that. By defining the relationship of objects, we're untangling complexity early in the process, creating a more streamlined process, helping avoid costly rework later in the game, and ensuring a solid foundation for building intuitive and user-centered systems. The third question of the ORCA process talks about call to actions. What are the call to actions that the objects offer the users? We want to ensure we orient our call to actions around their objects so our interactions are intuitive and straightforward as possible. When our CTAs are clearly tied to the objects, users can easily understand what are the actions available for each of those objects. It helps avoid scattering interactions all across the interface, ensuring that all available actions are logically placed and able and easily findable. Similar to relationships, we also need to visualize this type of CTAs. We do it through another matrix. The way that it works is that we bring in our objects again across the x-axis. Then we bring in our different user roles, and we start listing out all the actions that the objects offer the different users. So here we have a venue can be rated or favored by a consumer. A venue can be only edited by the venue. I don't have an example of the support, but a venue can only be created by the support staff at Volt. So here in the menu, the user will only be able to read those we call weak CTAs. We don't include those here. But a menu can be added or edited by the merchant. For the menu item, the consumer can add to an order or remove from an order that menu item. And the merchant can add to the menu a menu item or edit the menu item itself. For the order, it can only be initiated by the consumer or modified. And the actions that the order offers the merchants is to be able to accept or reject. We have LinkedIn again. I'm not going to go through all of them, but on the person, in the case of a person, some of the actions that we can see is a person can be connected to another person. A person can be followed, reported, or blocked by a person, and you get the idea. So the main questions that we're asking in this stage are why and when. We really want to understand the user's motivations. What does the user hope to get from this action? We also want to challenge those CTAs that sometimes appears in a requirement that we might not have a clear understanding on why they will want to do it. We also want to be aware of the context, any requirements or prerequisites that the user needs to have before they can interact with a certain object. By asking this question, it's going to help us align with the user goals, contextualize the actions, and drive key business outcomes. In general, what we're really trying to avoid is having the light switch of the bathroom outside in the hallway. The last but not least question of the ORCA process talks about attributes. What are the attributes that make up the objects? By defining the attributes of the objects, it helps us figure out what's going to go in the page before we design the page. Attributes are split into two categories, core content and metadata. Core content, you can think of anything that's going to be unique for every instance of your object. So think about name, image, descriptions, things like that. And metadata, I know we can get in a lot of conversations with engineers on what metadata is, but the most important thing for us is to know if we want users to be able to sort, filter, or group by. As we start adding our attributes into the nested object matrix, we're creating what ORCA practitioners call an object map. An object map is the holy grail of object-oriented UX. It's how I started learning about this process, and it gives you a bird's eye X-ray view of the entire system. As I mentioned earlier, ORCA requires blue, yellow, red, and green stickies, and this is because us ORCA practitioners would love to be able to read an object map anywhere in the world without the need of previous information. So please, please keep your objects in blue, core content in yellow, metadata in red, and call to actions in green. This is what the object map would look like after we have taken our nested object matrix and added our attributes. So we have name and image as the core content for a person, and job title and location as metadata. For a post, it looks like I did a little bit of prioritization. This is also another useful thing we can do with an object map. We can start deciding what is the piece of information we want to have visible for the users on those smaller views, on the list view, on the card views, and what can be one click away. More examples of what an object map could represent. This is in the context of the Vault app. And we can also translate these into wireframe formats. Some designers might go straight into final visuals, but as having this defined from the object map, we are ensuring that we're adding information that we actually need on the screens. The questions that are going to continue to come up as we try to define this are, what information do we need to show? What are options of these attributes? We want to have some examples to start creating that mental image of what this object is. How might we want to sort, filter, or group by? This is what's going to differentiate our core content from metadata. These seem as simple questions that sometimes don't actually get defined until it gets to development, and many times also developers are making those decisions, which a lot of times don't align with the user's mental model. So let's design our screens with confidence by knowing what goes on the page before we design the page. A lot of the back and forth that was probably happening before is going to increasingly be reduced as a lot of the hard questions are already answered. With object-oriented UX mindset and the ORCA process, you'll be able to reduce the guesswork and integrate the entire team earlier in the process. You'll be able to collaborate with all your stakeholders and create a common understanding with the team early. You'll be able to speed up development by speaking the same language as developers. And ultimately, you'll create better outcomes for the business and the users. So let's bridge the gap between research and design with the help of ORCA. And let's improve UX in general by making sure we're super clear on what our screens represent before we jump into visual designs. Thank you for your time. We do have some time for Q&A, but before that, I would like to invite you to join the OOUX forum hosted by Sophia Prater. So if you would like to join, please scan this. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. It was Gabriela Ospina. It was an excellent talk. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
And now we have some time for your questions. Do you have any questions? Yes, I can see some hands. Sorry, the first hand.
Hi, Gabriela. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question, do you have any tips how to implement this process in projects that are already in progress? Thank you.
Yes, this is a very common question. So the most important thing of this are the questions that you're trying to get answered. So if you already know your objects and you just need to figure out the call to actions, the ones that you really need, start from there. So make sure you're getting answers to the questions or most of the questions that I listed here, and that's how you're going to start understanding your domain. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. I'm going up to the next question. Oh, that was the same question. Okay.
I can expand on that a little bit more. Also, as I mentioned earlier, by defining the objects, if you want to start with discovering what are the objects in your project, start reverse engineering your designs. Trying to figure out, is this thing a noun? Is this thing an object? And then go from there. All right, what is this thing made out of? And then you'll be able to build your object map and see the entire system.
Thank you. I wanted to say great minds think alike. That's why the same question. Does anybody have? Yes, I see another one.
Thank you. I have one question about whether there is some sort of prioritization in which call to actions or attributes to prioritize in a flow, because as objects appear in different entry points and screens, there might be, let's say, one call to action that needs to overpower the others, and you need to make decisions about the relationship between the objects based on, the primary user goal.
Yeah.
So do you have any advice on how to make these decisions?
Yeah, so this is why it's important to understand the context in which the users will be interacting with those objects. So depending on the context of that, then we need to prioritize which of those actions available in the object we want to surface to the user at a certain point.
Thanks, Gabriela. Great talk. I must admit I'm a newbie to object-oriented UX, programming, whatever, but it totally makes sense to me. And me being a researcher, being selfish, can you maybe talk a little bit about how you make those decisions? Because you had some questions that need to be asked in order to confirm your objects, your CTAs, and so. Can you maybe just briefly touch on how do you find this out? Kind of what method you use, or?
By talking to everyone, by bringing in our stakeholders and asking those questions. The thing a lot of times designers are having or product creation teams are struggling with is knowing what are really the questions that we need to answer at a certain point. So when we have a structure that's going to allow us to ask those questions, then we can decide what's going to be the answer. Sometimes we leave those questions or answers to the designer because that's what we start with. That's what we have to start the conversations. But if we start with questions, then everyone is part of the process and everyone can answer the questions. Hopefully that helped.
Okay, so it's more like you have interviews, conversations with them.
Yeah, so if you don't have an answer, that's what I said, go back into research, try to figure out who will be the best person to answer this question, who's your knowledge expert that can help you answer that.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
Those are really good questions and answers.
Thanks.
Does anybody want to ask anything else? I see no other hands. Do we have any questions in the app? We are checking. Yes, we do have questions. Sorry. Yeah, we have one question. Do you use this type of describing system as a part of documentation so you can return and learn about the structure? Or it's a part of the current process design and not used anymore? I can show it to you so that...
I understand, yeah,
Okay.
thank you. Great, yes, amazing question. Yes, ideally, we reference this whenever we need to add any feature into the product to understand what was the purpose, what was like the mechanics, what is it supposed to do. It's very beneficial for newcomers joining a team as well, where we need to explain what does this thing do. Most of the times, if the same team is working on a specific domain, they don't go back to it, but at some point, someone will need that information. So if we document it at the beginning, it's just going to be easier later on.
Thanks a lot. Do we have any new questions now? Okay, there is one.
I might have a question because you talked about easier processes. When it comes to like more complex interfaces, how does your map look like?
Yes, so it's like what I show is just not even a quarter of what a normal map would look like. We will have more than 20 objects. So, but you're not working all the time with all the objects. So what's most important is to understand the relationship. So if you're working on a specific area of a product, most likely you're working with 5 or 10 objects at a time. The important thing is communication on larger teams, knowing that if you are the owner or responsible individual for this section, another person working in a different area, if they see that there is connection between your objects and theirs, it is a sign that, okay, you must talk to each other to ensure that things are not disconnected and we're not creative, unintuitive, and shapeshifters.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? We still have a little time. But if not, then please, everybody, give a last round of applause to Gabriela for this great, great talk.